This roundtable will have for theme the future of Europe, actors, risks, and opportunities. We have Joachim BITTERLICH, who's the former ambassador, former European diplomacy and security policy advisor to the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and he's also a professor at the ESCP, Business School of Paris. We have Pat Cox, who is our president, but also the former president of the European Parliament. We have Sylvie MATELLY, right there. And she's the director of the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris. She's also a member of our scientific committee. We have Viviane Reding, right there, former vice president of the European Commission. We have Klaus REGLING, can see right there in the middle, former managing director of the European Stability Mechanism. And finally, we have an animation by Chantal TAUXE, right there. And she's a journalist and also vice president of the new European Movement for Switzerland. Thank you very much and enjoy the roundtable.
Merci beaucoup, Lucie. Alors, je vais m'adonner à une tâche très difficile, mesdames et messieurs. Je vais essayer en 3 minutes de résumer un petit peu les discussions d'hier et celles de ce matin par rapport, évidemment, au thème du colloque. Donc, ce qu'on a entendu hier, notamment dans la bouche de Gilles Grain, le directeur de l'Institut, c'est que finalement, les hommes et les femmes déterminés dans le processus de décision, ça compte. De même que de disposer d'un livre blanc, d'un catalogue d'idées et de propositions, c'est aussi très utile pour avancer. On a compris également l'importance des réseaux et aussi des réseaux qui ont peut-être une certaine permanence, de la continuité. Et puis, on a saisi évidemment l'importance du sens du compromis et de l'intérêt général. Ça va sans dire, mais apparemment, ça ne va pas toujours aussi facilement qu'on pourrait le penser. Alors, avant de donner la parole aux 5 intervenants pour des propos liminaires, j'aimerais un peu lancer la discussion qui va suivre avec finalement cette idée de livre blanc et de catalogue d'idées pour avancer. On a désormais sur la table, en ce début de nouvelle mandature pour la Commission européenne, le rapport Draghi, le rapport L'État, et on peut se dire qu'il y a matière à un livre blanc. Il y a des enjeux financiers qui sont extraordinaires. L'homme du « quoi qu'il en coûte » nous dit qu'il faudrait finalement pouvoir investir à hauteur de 800 milliards d'euros par an. Je me réjouis d'entendre M. REGLING sur ce point précis. Et donc, voilà. Est-ce que finalement, dans ce contexte, est-ce qu'on est bien outillé pour avancer? Parce que ce qu'on a compris hier, c'est que à 6, c'était plus simple d'avancer qu'à 27. Mais à 27, quand il y a une crise, on arrive quand même à décider, comme on l'a vu avec les fonds de relance post-Covid. Ladies first, je vais commencer par donner la parole pour quelques propos liminaires à Madame Reding, ancienne vice-présidente de la Commission européenne, luxembourgeoise, personnalité bien connue dans les milieux européens avec un très beau parcours.
Thank you so much, and as has been said very clearly, Europe advances in small steps, very small steps sometimes. But if there is a crisis, it can go out of its boundaries and take decisions very quickly. We have seen it with the COVID crisis, where even if Europe has no competence on the matter, it has managed to bring us out of the crisis. We have seen it also with the war in Ukraine. Europe has no competence in security, but it managed to put everybody together in order to go into one direction. Now, if we want to know in which direction we can go, we have, of course, to know the past. And when you look at the past, I think that is very impressive. We came out of the Second World War together and said, never more any war. We are going to build peace. We are going to build well-being. Well, we managed inside of Europe to bring the war goers together to build peace, and we built a multicultural, multi-political ensemble which can act as a whole. So it is a real success story which concentrates on well-being. 60% of the budget is allocated to more or less social affairs. And we were lying back because things went so well. So relying on cheap security from the USA, on cheap energy from Russia, and on cheap manufacturing from China. Okay, until we were confronted with the problem that we were not self-sufficient and we didn't have a lot of friends around of us. So what do we need to do? And I think everybody agrees, we need to strengthen the European pillar of NATO, to coordinate and build synergies in defense investment and industry building. It's very interesting to see that most of the arms we are delivering to Ukraine, we buy them first in the United States. Doesn't make sense at all. And we have to win in efficiency and capacity of the armed forces. We are only in our capacity 15% of the capacity of the United States. Doesn't make sense, so we really have to change there, and we're going to change. You might have seen that Ursula von der Leyen has proposed to have a commissioner for defense and for space. Interesting to bring defense and space together, but that will be another debate. The same has to be done for the European pillar of industry and economic sovereignty. In a nutshell, when I make the analysis, technology is going to be the backbone of security, industry, economic development. Europe is very good in several elements, but unexisting in others. And Europe has to decide, is it going to be a standard maker or a standard taker? Is it going to be a technology maker or a technology buyer? And from this will depend all its future, be it in well-being, in social affairs, in security, in economy, or whatever. So, good news. We are good in research. We are good in talent producing. We are good in setting up young, promising startups. And then we stop. Then the problem starts. We don't manage to put our promises into facts. I'll give you some examples. Digital platforms. Europe has 4 out of worldwide 50. Cloud markets. Europe has 15% worldwide. AI developments. 75% of the foundational models are in US, 15% in China. I don't need to say what's in Europe. From the 150 big tech companies we managed to create between 2008 and 2021, 40 left Europe in order to install themselves in the United States. Why? Because we lack private investment, because we lack venture capital, and not because the money is not there in Europe, but per year 300 billion of European money goes into the United States bond market. So instead of being invested in Europe, the money is invested elsewhere. So I give you other examples. The risk capital, I don't speak about subsidies and things like that. I speak about where the real money is coming from and where you can build industries. Risk capital for AI between 21 and 23, the United States 80 billion, China 30 billion, EU 12 billion. Venture capital investment in Europe is 10%, 10 times higher in the US than in Europe. And the result is very clear. We cannot compete, and that is why I hope that this Commission is finally going to do what the Commission of Jean-Claude Juncker proposed in 2015, which is on the table and which Letta and Draghi asked for, a capital market union, in order to allow private investment to flourish and investment to take place. And speaking about Letta and Draghi, I would like to say it's not only the capital, it's also how do we utilize the single market. The single market is our big wealth. Why then go to fragmentation? Why then go back to regionalism? Why then go to Kleinstaaterei, as they say it in Germany, small, small? I will give you a very clear example for what we need to do in the future, and that will be my last example. Instead of investing into knowledge, giving that to other continents, and then trying to build it back, we should keep the knowledge, research, talent in Europe. Quantum computing will be trailblazing in the next 2 or 3 years. It will be the basis, the infrastructure basis for all technological development in the world. Europe is leading. We have most experts worldwide in talent. We are the second worldwide in international patent families. But the 5 biggest industries are in the United States, and the 4 next industries are in China. And we have in Europe a company which knows to build quantum computers and which is selling quantum computers. We could, if we would put the effort on this company, make a European champion and a world champion. But the mentality is missing to do it. So what the next Commission, the next Council, and the next Parliament have to do is to bring back the mentality of the leaders and not of the followers.
Thank you, Ms. Regling. J'aimerais maintenant donner la parole à Sylvie MATELLY, directrice de l'Institut Jacques Delors à Paris.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing that conference and inviting me. Well, as in the Draghi, that will only be preliminary remarks, and I think we will discuss after during the debate. As in the Letta and Draghi reports, we always compare the EU to the US. I wanted to do that comparison too. First of all, I think that after 2008, after the crisis, the US and the US administration understood that the main challenges in the few years will be China. And then all the strategy and all policies were oriented to fight against China power and to limit the possibility for China to become the first power in the world in the future. Then if you think about And that are important in that field. If you think about the Obama recovery plan, it was 400 billion. Can you see? It is pretty close from the evaluation of Draghi. We lost some time, and it is the double, but it is the same kind of amount. Then 400 billion for the recovery plan, and mostly to invest in energy and gas shale. Then and the idea was to reduce the gap between production costs between China and the US. Just after that, we had seen a lot of, I would call that counter-political, counter-cyclical policies when the US and US administration invest a lot in sort of recovery policy while the growth were there. And that's really interesting. That was the tax cut from Trump. And after that was the huge investment in infrastructure from Biden just after the COVID period. And since the US economy recovery only in 10 months. Then they spend a lot. They invest a lot, probably sooner than us. Consequently, first, after 2008 and to the COVID period, the USA has known the longest period of growth in its economic history. Second consequences, the decline of the Chinese growth. You may understand then during the COVID, we may remember that during the COVID period, US invest around 25% of their GDP in the economy, that public investment in the economy. During that time in Europe, we did a lot too. In 2010, we adopt new policies to fight the euro crisis. After 2014, it was the invasion of Crimea by Russia, and we invest in defense, and we begin to think about investing more in defense. In 2016, it was the Brexit and Trump. In 2020, the COVID. In 2022, war in Ukraine. After all that crisis, we took initiatives. We invest in new projects, in new instruments. But the main difference probably with the US is that at the end, we did in reaction of the crisis. Well, we are in the Fondation Jean Monnet. Then we know that Europe will exist because of crisis and will be the sum of the reaction of that crisis. But at the end, even if we did a lot, even if in reality we invest a lot, we invest in, I would say, fragmented policies, and probably in policies that are not coherent and not supporting a strategy. And I think what we have to do today, and what we have to do in the future, and that's the main, I think that's the main conclusion of the Letta-Draghi report, but also about the organization of the new commission and the strategic agenda of that new commission. We need now to think about why we want to invest more. Because when you, I call that on my paper this sort of millefeuille of initiatives. When you do that, you create a lot of opportunities for fragmentations. Just think about the example of state aids. During the COVID period, we allowed states to support their economy, to support their companies because of the COVID and the COVID consequences. But at the end, the big countries did a lot and invest a lot. And I think this is one cause of the fragmentation we can see today on the single market. Then we have to think about that strategy. And when you think about a strategy, you have to define what do you want. We are today in a world where, because the US and China are trying to keep the advantage in the world economy, the state invest a lot in the economy. That's a reality. And we have to find a way to react to that and to support the European interest. But in the same time, I said that, I think most of the Europeans will agree with that. But in the same time, we want to preserve nation and national interest. We never had two main countries in Europe, France and Germany, as weak as they are today. We are still strongly divided about the recipe to improve the EU. Is it free trade policy or economic security? Is it competition or industrial policy? Do we have to support consumer by reducing prices and promote competition, or social policies? Do we have to reduce our public debt or to invest more in the future? Even if you think about sovereignty, we all agree that we all agree today, and that's, I think, a good thing about Europe, need to improve more and need to invest in sovereignty. But what kind of sovereignty? Against or with the US? With China or against China? That's really difficult, and we are really divided on that topic. And I hope that a white paper will begin to answer such questions. But I think it is really important to talk about that questions in the perspective to think about a strategy with clear objectives. And when you have clear objectives, you can find the policy you need to do. But without, you will just take initiative in reaction of crisis, but not a strategy. Thanks a lot.
Merci beaucoup, Madame MATELLY. Je vais maintenant donner la parole à Pat Cox, notre président de la Fondation Jean Monnet.
Merci beaucoup, Chantal. La première chose que je voudrais dire est de m'excuser pour mon absence hier, qui était à cause d'une force majeure, des orages à Londres qui m'a bloqué, qui ont retardé et finalement annulé les vols que j'ai prévus le jour en avant. J'aimerais bien remercier personnellement, au nom de la Fondation Jean Monnet, chaque participant ici, aujourd'hui et hier. Nous sommes très honorés avec votre présence et merci beaucoup pour cela. Et surtout, un mot de remerciement personnel à Michael Galler, qui a conceptualisé ces journées. Et Michael, merci beaucoup pour cela. Permit me, in terms of what we're discussing, which I find really interesting, perhaps to pick up some of the themes and elaborate. I want to zoom up. We love introspection in the European Union, but we're living in a complex geopolitical environment. The first thing concerning, Chantal, you talked about actors. I think the first key thing I want to mention briefly, but I think it's important, is who will win the US presidential election and who will win a majority in Congress and Senate. If it is Mr. Trump, he will be, predictably, a great disruptor. He will be, predictably, someone who I think risks to undermine Europeans' sense of security by being willing to trade over the head of Ukraine to cut some kind of a deal with Vladimir Putin, if his own words are to be believed. He will be someone who seems to have an endless appetite for imposing tariffs on trade, which is not in our interest, and seems to misunderstand that tariffs are paid by his own citizens in the end, but he projects them as being paid by foreigners. We would lose output, but we wouldn't be paying the tariff. Our price would be the loss of output. All of these things are there, and who knows what else. I think should he return, he will have less guardrails in terms of checks and balances to do with law and potentially Congress than any president in modern history in the United States. If, on the other hand, Kamala Harris wins, I think Europe will breathe a sigh of relief. It doesn't mean that all of our issues have gone away. It's just that she is more sympathetic to some of the traditional alliances and perspectives on which Europe has relied. But expect her to be the president asserting the interests of the United States, but I think more user-friendly from a European point of view. It's very clear that that election is almost impossible to call. I follow assiduously the various polls. We know that the critical issue because of this electoral college is not just winning the popular vote, but winning the electoral college. The magic number is to arrive at 270 electoral college votes, and the routes are through 4 Midwestern states and 3 Southern states. And they are all within the margin of error of the polling that has been done. Trump is ahead in 3 the last time I looked. Harris is ahead in 4, but they're all within the margin of error. So this is a too close to call election. I'm shocked by it with someone like Trump that he's still so eminently fixed to be a potential president again, but there it is. What I would like to do then in that context is to look in a way at some of the elements that I think have brought about Trump as a response to other underlying conditions. If we step back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, the United States had its unilateral moment of power. And in that unilateral moment, its biggest shock, I would say, was the 9/11, September of 2001. And the response was to declare a war on terror. For the first time, Article 5 of NATO was invoked. Le Monde said, "Nous sommes tous des Américains." So, everyone was together in a sense. But in choosing to have this ambition of bringing democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, it ended up in the sand, like so many imperial or neo-imperial postures in that region over long periods of time. And so that bit didn't work and left the United States feeling diminished. The second thing was the extraordinary pile of bad debt that was built up in the United States that led to the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008 and eventually to all of the economic crisis and our Eurozone crisis and so on here in Europe. I think what that established was that the appetite for deregulation, which had been so powerful, had gone too far, and it was time for the pendulum in the USA to swing back somewhat. A third dimension I would pick is at the level of world trade. In his very last speech, State of the Union speech in 2002, Bill Clinton talked about China joining the WTO as being good for Americans and good for China. In his inaugural address in January of 2017, Trump talked about American carnage. And the two presidents in the two speeches were talking about the same thing, about trade and what its presumed effect was. Now, in picking those bits of political rhetoric, I realize there's a lot more underneath. But the reason I go to this is because I think if we're locating Europe and strategy, we have been big beneficiaries of what I would call predictable multilateralism and strong multilateral institutions over many years. We live in a multipolar world, and if we are coherent, we as Europeans can speak in a coherent space in that multilateral world, in that multipolar world. But multilateralism as we knew it is now under threat. So we have the coexistence of multipolarity with contested multilateralism. And this gives us a trickier foreign policy strategic challenge than before. So my sense that Kaja Kallas, who will take on now the foreign policy role and who will be strong on Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Russia and so on, because she's of course a former Prime Minister of Estonia, or Andrius Kubilius, I think it was Viviane mentioned the defence policy, he's a former Prime Minister of Lithuania. So I think they're going to be, so far as the system will permit them, to be strong advocates for change. But we need in Europe to contemplate wider issues of foreign policy. How do we locate ourselves in this multipolar world with contested multilateralism? And here I think no matter who is the US president, we have a real challenge. Because it is quite clear, and it has been said here already twice, that you have between America and China now a great power rivalry. And we are in the middle. And we have relations with both sides in different degrees and, of course, with very different histories. And the more we rely, in particular, on American security guarantees for Europe, which we're happy to have and which we want to sustain with a stronger Euro pillar inside NATO, or in parallel with NATO, not in competition with NATO, the more I believe we are constrained about how we play the other game. Because you can't look for the guarantees on one side from the USA and tell them, and forgive the unparliamentary language, but tell them to piss off when it comes to issues of trade or economic security. So I think Europe has a delicate balance. And I think we need, as we look at foreign policy, to think through a strategy which is more subtle than before. The other dimension I think that I would add on this foreign policy perspective is we should not write off, and I know it's a kind of a phrase that we use that is a bit loose in definitional terms, we should not write off the global south. The global south is non-West, but the global south is not ipso facto anti-West. And we've got to get better at finding and building partnerships with the non-West but not anti-West global south. And we haven't been great at that so far. And a lot of them see us as hectoring and lecturing and paternalistic and knowing best. So we need a new narrative and a new language of engagement to be able to optimize. Why? Because if we have a good single market, if we get all of that together, we need access to markets and we need partnerships that allow us to thrive and grow and develop. And let us understand this. In the past, it was true, and one of the great elements of Western democracy and what I'd call post-war multilateralism was that the democracies were growing and thriving, and the other places weren't working. Whether we like it or not now to do with systems, China is an advanced economy and has made extraordinary progress. Or at the other end of the size scale, Singapore has been extraordinary. So if you're in the market of shopping for development models, there's the Western democratic one, but there's also other more autocratic ones. So it's a much more diverse play on that front. The second and last thing I want to touch on briefly about Letta, Draghi, new commission and strategy and so on. Many of you will know, and certainly those who are in European affairs, the work that was done by Pierre Werner in 1969, promulgating the idea of a single currency, of economic and monetary union. That got trapped by the consequences of the Yom Kippur War, and so it never happened in the timescale foreseen. But nonetheless, a lot of work happened, and one of them was a report chaired by a Brit, MacDougall, looking at the question of financing the then European Economic Community. And what he talked about was the need for a level of pre-federal finance. He was looking at something like 2 to 3 percentage points of GDP. Now, we've never got there. As we know, the sum of the willingness of all of the member states lodges somewhere around 1% of GDP as the scale of the EU budget. The one breach in that system was the Resilience and Recovery Programme and the willingness to allow the European Union to collateralise the borrowing through EU and to pay back through the EU budget. And now we're at a real moment of definition to do with EU's spending capacity over the coming period. If the rule was you borrowed the money, we give you the 1% limit on your budget, and now you must start paying back, it will be less than 1% to do all the things you want to do. Or alternatively, you roll over the debt some way, or you look at some of these mechanisms. And I would be very interested in particular to hear Klaus Regling's sense of what are the possibilities. The politics of this is always complicated, but what are the possibilities? If we don't do that, Europe will not have a great budgetary capacity to step forward to this strategic future of which we speak. And in that context, this issue, and it really rests with member states and capital cities and national parliaments, do we really want Europe, and are we prepared to invest in our own Europe? And that is my question to do with the money question. So between foreign policy strategy and money issues, this isn't in the bag. It's not a done deal, and we have a lot of homework still to do. Thank you for your attention.
And now, Klaus Regling, you have the floor.
I just got my question then.
And you have the question, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's easy to be pessimistic about Europe today. The geopolitics are awful. There are wars around us. Europe is squeezed between the two superpowers, China and United States. Globalization as such was wonderful for Europe because it was very compatible with the way we in Europe are organized. The EU is the best model for multilateralism, and it really works. And Europe is the most open economy. But globalization has come to an end. We see now deglobalization. Also, of course, we are all aware that the EU has grown tremendously. When I went first to Brussels in the early 80s, there were 8 countries around the table. Then there were 28 at one point. We are back to 27. But probably over the next decades, there will be 35 countries. And that in itself makes it more difficult to work and to come to quick results. Also, nationalism is back in many countries, to a large extent triggered by migration. We heard about that earlier today. And the leaders of the past, who we often admire because they had a strong vision of what to do, they were influenced very much by World War II and some even World War I. They are gone. It's good that we didn't have wars the past few decades, but the leaders today are different from the old leaders. As I said, there are many reasons to be pessimistic about Europe. Also, we talked about yesterday the traditional models that France and Germany takes the leadership on issues, work well together, and others follow. Doesn't work today because the leaders don't agree often. And also, it's not as easy as it used to be, given that we are 27 countries, where other countries will not easily accept such leadership, which doesn't exist at the moment. So easy to be pessimistic. But looking back, Europe has come a long way. And I've experienced this often, that when you are in the middle of a crisis, you are desperate because Europe is moving so slowly. But when you look back, things have actually happened quite quickly sometimes, particularly, as Viviane Reding said, in a crisis. Normally, the EU moves very, very slowly, but in a crisis, one can jump. And we have seen that many times. In the early 80s, everybody was talking about Eurosclerosis. Then Delors came and created the single market and started the way to the monetary union. The global financial crisis, 2008, affected many countries around the world, also Europe. But we did lots of things in response to that crisis. And remember, early last year, there were several US banks who got into trouble. Also, Credit Suisse, second largest bank in Switzerland, had to be taken over by UBS. In the EU, we had no problem. There was no banking problem in this very similar environment where interest rates started rising again. The euro crisis, where I spent a lot of energy, looked really bad. There was a real risk that the euro area would shrink. I don't think the euro would disappear like the Anglo-Saxons thought, many of them, but there was a real risk that 2 or 3 countries would have to leave. If that had happened, I think Europe would be in a different shape today, much, much weaker. That was avoided, and not only was it avoided, but I think after some years today, it's clear that the way we dealt with the euro crisis was a big success, because the 5 countries that needed money from European partners, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and Cyprus, they all have a better economic performance today than all other European countries. Corona, we had talked yesterday about Next Generation EU. That year, 2020, was a very difficult year for many countries around the world. GDP dropped by the biggest amount in decades. The Next Generation EU package was completely innovative and does a lot of good in southern European countries. It doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but it was a big, big step in response to Corona. So I think we have demonstrated during crisis that we can act. The circumstances may be more difficult. We lack leadership. We have difficult geopolitical environment. Deglobalization doesn't help our economic performance. Cooperation between major countries is not good. But this can change again. And my hope is that it could change under the impression of what's happening around us. The geopolitics, the wars. If Trump becomes president again, and as Pat Cox says, he is a disruptor, then Europe should realize that it has to get its act together and integrate more. And the experts know what needs to be done. You can all read it in the Letter and Draghi report, and there are many others. And you don't have to agree on everything. The question of more European debt is a very small one. Unfortunately, the German establishment jumped at that, but that's totally inadequate. There are many good ideas there. We have European public goods that need to be increased. On defense, that was mentioned, on climate change, on border controls. And I think one can build a case, that was Pat's question in the end, on having a bigger EU budget. One has to explain it to the frugal countries that this means shifting responsibilities from the national level to the European level. So expenditures that so far are done at the national level can be more efficiently used at the EU level, for instance, on defense, where we have today 20 procurement systems. If it were done at the EU level for the same amount of money, one can get much more out of it. So it's more productive. It does not mean more public expenditures. It's just shifting from the national to the EU level. It does not increase the share of the public sector in GDP. It does not increase the fiscal deficit overall. So it's just using the money more efficiently. And I think one has to explain that to the public. And that's one way to have a larger EU budget, which I think is unavoidable. Yeah. Let me end here.
Thank you, Mr. Regling. And maintenant pour 5 minutes, Joachim BITTERLICH, c'est à vous. Attention.
Thank you very much. It's strange. It's true. It's easy to be pessimistic today. But what we need, what is another spirit? Really another spirit among Europeans. Otherwise, we are about to lose our future. And it's so strange for me that we are totally, what I call, in a defensive position in any area. We are not setting the agenda. Instead of, let's say, being aware and conscious about the reality, we are renationalizing policies or responses. At the same time, we know exactly that the only way for the Europeans is to act together on the side. Therefore, in order to rebuild what I call confidence of our citizens, confidence of our economic actors, confidence in research, what we need is what I call agenda setting. And what I would like to say is, please, let's concentrate on 4 areas in Europe. And I would like not to deepen the aspects of European industrial policy. We are losing industrial policy. We are losing industry. Look at the situation of car industry. Look at the situation of high-tech in Europe. Strategic autonomy is, for me, the catchword. Strategic autonomy with regard to the US, with regard to China. And insofar, I'm speaking about research. Why the hell research in Europe is so, let's say, stick to classical bureaucratic schemes? Why we are so risk-averse in Europe? I'm part of an initiative created 3 years ago in Paris, JEDI called, Disruptive Innovation in Europe. We are blocked by the research community in Europe, by the Max Planck, by the Fraunhofer, the CNRS, and others, who stick to their budgets, who stick to their classical, let's say, approach with regard to research. We have proposed to take the American approach of 1958. After the Sputnik, the Americans launched the DARPA. We have asked for the same story in Europe in order to revamp research, in order to reduce our distance towards China and towards the US. Up till now, we are blocked on this. No one has up till now the courage, let's say, to say, stop, let's be less risk-averse, let's concentrate on real technological areas in Europe to revamp European research in these fields. Second subject, I mentioned it yesterday, security and migration. A key subject for the Europeans, internal security plus migration. We dream about, let's say, the Canadian or the Australian solution. It's perfectly possible to do so. It's not even difficult, but we are there in this area where everyone looks at its national areas without understanding what's at stake. Third area, security and defense. Yes, we need a certain new transatlantic agenda. Yes, it has to do with foreign policy, it has to do with security. It's, for me, it's useless to reflect about who will be the next American president. It's not we are electing the president, it's the Americans. And we have to accept who will be in power in the US. It will be either Trump or Harris. Both will be difficult with us. Please, Europeans, wake up at the end. I've been asking European industry, please formulate what's in your view, the future transatlantic agenda? What are the main points of this in trade, in investment, in taxation, etc., including defense? How we realize what I call 3% GDP for defense? That's the key, not 2%, forget about it. 3. 3 is the subject. How we are able to put this into music. And the last one, foreign policy. Foreign policy, there's the absence of a European foreign policy. I regret. We have no common foreign policy. It was the wrong approach in my eyes. Please, let's concentrate on what's essential. Essential first, there is the relationship with the US. Yes, it's clear. The Global South, Pat Cox, yes. Even if this Global South is not unified, is not existing. It's reality. We have missed this point. Where are we? Nowhere. And the third one is, after mentioning the subject, well, we have not really touching it. It's EU enlargement. How to consolidate our bases in Europe. How to integrate the Balkans. I know exactly that the majority of capitals are not ready to integrate and to ratify the enlargement treaty with the 6 Balkan countries. Please, dear friends, there are alternative solutions. We have not to reinvent them, but we have to do it at the end of the day, because our security, our future is there. And if we are not able to integrate Europe as a whole, please, Europe will be at its end. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, ambassadeur BITTERLICH. Maintenant, en principe, on devait permettre aux participants à cette table ronde de se répondre mutuellement, mais leur tourne. Alors, j'aimerais essayer de faire le lien entre ces enjeux, ces défis que vous avez tous posés. On est à un moment de wake-up call, hein, vous l'avez dit à plusieurs reprises, et compte tenu de l'expérience que vous avez les uns et les autres dans les institutions européennes, alors comment on va arriver à cette coordination, cette convergence? Finalement, est-ce que tout va venir de la Commission? Est-ce que c'est le Conseil européen? On a parlé des chercheurs. Est-ce que finalement les réseaux de chercheurs ou les réseaux d'industriels ne doivent pas être mieux informés et coordonnés? Finalement, si l'heure est grave, comment on va arriver à cette volonté générale? Qui doit prendre un peu l'initiative? Je ne sais pas, Monsieur Regling, Monsieur Cox, Madame Reding, Monsieur BITTERLICH, qui veut répondre?
Je vais commencer brièvement. L'Europe a une triple dimension en decision-making. Et les trois doivent se coordonner pour arriver à une décision. Les seuls qui proposent, c'est la Commission. Donc, une forte commission, et vous avez peut-être remarqué que dernièrement, la commission a un peu changé d'un modèle transversal vers un modèle pyramidal. Ce qui, en temps de crise, est une bonne chose, à mon avis. On peut en discuter, mais moi, je parle toujours de l'efficacité, hein, pour ne pas aller dans tous les sens. Et je suis d'accord avec tous ceux qui disent que le grand problème, ce sont les États membres. Parce que en fait, le nationalisme et le moi-je et mes petits champions régionaux prennent le dessus sur l'intérêt général. Parce que l'intérêt général, qui est européen, parce que nous sommes en concurrence avec la Chine, les États-Unis et demain l'Inde, et pas entre le Luxembourg et les États-Unis et l'Inde, n'est-ce pas? Donc, c'est très clair, nous pouvons seulement gagner si nous éliminons la fragmentation. Les deux institutions qui luttent pour éliminer la fragmentation sont la Commission européenne et le Parlement. Et ceux qui sont un problème sont les États membres. En ce qui concerne la recherche, je voudrais quand même être un peu moins négative parce que on a un joyau de la recherche mondiale qu'est le programme Horizon. Et le monde entier essaye de faire partie du programme Horizon. Et j'ai donné quelques exemples aussi où nous sommes world leading en matière de recherche. Nous le sommes. Et j'étais responsable pendant 5 ans quand même de la recherche technologique en Europe, donc je connais un tout petit peu. Et je vous dis, on est bon. Mais les effets de la recherche, on les perd. C'est ça que j'ai essayé de vouloir expliquer. Parce que quand on met la recherche dans la commercialisation, dans l'industrialisation, on perd. Et là où il y a une différence entre nous et les Américains, c'est pas la recherche publique, mais c'est la recherche privée. Les Américains, ils investissent beaucoup plus dans la recherche privée et ils investissent beaucoup plus dans l'investissement privé. C'est ce que j'avais essayé de dire aussi dans ma présentation.
Merci Viviane Reding. Je crois que Pat Cox veut répondre.
I'm just going to, I mean, there are lots of things. I'm encouraged, I must say, by the positive response of Klaus Regling on the budget question. I mean, we can do this. We need political will to do it. I think we do have a struggle with German ordo-liberalism on this front, and it's of all governments of Germany, and then complicated if the government itself finds it difficult to find consensus. But I want to turn to the disruptive innovation thing. I think it's a really interesting point. You have really the two things. You spend money on invention, and you make money through innovation. And if we're talking about innovation policy, a good deal of the focus of the research needs to be market-led, because you're going to sell it to someone in the end. And I would make an observation, and to go from the particular to the general, you know, I'm cautious about, but I do lots of things, and among them, I chair 2 innovative companies on the front of sustainability. One of them looking at new grid system transmission mechanisms, and one of them today on the market with low carbon cement, not in 2035, but today. And the observation I want to make is there's a European Innovation Fund, and both of those companies wanted to do scale up and applied. But the Innovation Fund recycles the money from steel and cement, let's call it in CO2 terms, dirty industry for the purpose of illustration. It takes the money in a carbon tax and it recycles to the dirty industry to clean up through carbon capture or whatever. And if you're clean tech, although it's an innovation fund, it doesn't actually apply. So the point I do want to make, I think there are, I'm not making special pleading here, we need to look at, does innovation matter? We need to look at market-led research if we want to lead. I don't have a problem with blue sky pure research. That's a great strength of European academia. But if we want to make money, we've got to turn innovation into product, and that means we relate what we do to markets and marketability and route to market.
And finance.
Indeed, but private finance comes forward with these things. The things I'm talking about have not had 1 cent of public finance, but they're already good to go through private finance. And the issue of having enough European finance is not that Europe pays, it gives a small incentive to crowd in private finance. That's the critical issue.
Alors, une petite réponse de Madame MATELLY. Ensuite, je donne la parole à Joachim BITTERLICH.
C'est une réaction à ce que je viens d'entendre et ça vient compléter ce que je viens d'entendre. Je crois que au cœur du sujet, et vous venez de le dire, Monsieur Cox, on a quand même la question de l'argent et des investissements. C'est vrai que l'investissement public entraîne par effet de levier de l'investissement privé, mais aujourd'hui, le marché, et vous l'avez dit, Madame Reding, les marchés financiers sont fragmentés en Europe, et par conséquent, on est en compétition par rapport à ça. Je crois qu'il y a un élément, quand on regarde ce qu'on est en train de vivre à l'extérieur de l'Union européenne, tout ce contexte géopolitique. Dans ce contexte géopolitique, il y a une confrontation Chine-États-Unis, on l'a tous dit. Et cette confrontation Chine-États-Unis, elle me fait étrangement penser à ce qu'on a connu pendant la guerre froide entre la Russie et les États-Unis, qui était une course aux armements. On n'est plus dans une course aux armements, on est dans une course aux armements. Mais au-delà de cette course aux armements, ce qu'on observe, c'est une sorte de course aux investissements en réalité. C'est-à-dire, j'investis, ça a été les routes de la soie pour la Chine, ça a été ensuite d'autres projets américains, dont l'IRA, etc., etc. Donc, on a l'impression qu'on est dans cette course aux armements. Dans le cas de la Chine et des États-Unis, l'enjeu est très clair. C'est de garder le leadership mondial. Nous ne sommes pas dans cette logique-là. Nous ne voulons pas, et nous avons des intérêts à garder des relations aussi approprié, je vais utiliser ce terme-là, que possible avec la Chine et avec les États-Unis. Il n'empêche que nous sommes confrontés à cette course aux investissements et que même si nous sommes bons sur des tas de choses, nous devons trouver un moyen de relancer les investissements européens. L'investissement public, pourquoi pas ? Ça me semble compliqué, mais peut-être que, comme vous le disiez, Madame Reding, la priorité des priorités, c'est cette union des marchés des capitaux pour enfin recycler l'épargne européenne en Europe. Et là, on aura de l'investissement privé, et on aura un investissement privé, encore une fois, dont il faudra veiller, qu'il ne conduise pas à produire de nouvelles fragmentations, puisque chaque initiative a eu plutôt tendance ces dernières années à produire des fragmentations parce qu'il n'y avait pas cette dimension stratégique derrière. Où veut-on aller ? Aujourd'hui, on réagit à un environnement. Où veut-on réellement aller ? Que veut-on construire ? L'Europe de demain, l'Europe du futur, mais qu'est-ce que ça veut dire ? Et là-dessus, je pense qu'il y a moyen de se mettre d'accord.
Merci. Joachim BITTERLICH.
Chère Viviane, je n'ai pas dit le contraire. Pour moi, ce qui est la clé, c'est la technologie future dans l'industrie et pour l'industrie européenne. Market-led research. Là est la clé. Et moi, je parie, l'argent est là en Europe. Sylvie a raison. Il faut essayer de réorienter nos économies qui partent aux États-Unis. Il faudrait les investir en Europe, oui. Mais de l'autre côté, pour moi, les États pourraient montrer ce qu'on appelle le bon exemple à cet égard. Nous avons une BEI, nous avons des banques nationales qui pourraient aider à cet égard. La Caisse des dépôts, la KfW en Allemagne, le modèle italien, etc. Et j'ai fait avec Enrico Letta le calcul que ça pourrait nous apporter entre 2 et 400 milliards par an s'ils étaient obligés, ces banques, de diriger l'investissement pour nos technologies de futur de pointe. Je vous donne un exemple bête et simple. J'ai écouté dernièrement un des spécialistes allemands pour ce que j'appelle les technologies du futur. Nous essayons depuis maintenant, je pense 4 ans, de monter un European Cloud. Vous avez entendu de cette histoire. C'est toujours pas de réalité. On dépend des Américains à cet égard et de plus en plus des Chinois. On est incapable parce que les Européens ont peur de la réaction des GAFA et des Chinois. On ne le fait pas. On est absent dans le 6G, dans le 7G pour la téléphonie du futur. Ce sont les Chinois, c'est Huawei, hein, ce sont les Américains, mais ce ne sont plus les Européens. Pourquoi nous ne sommes pas capables de prendre l'argent dans la main, comme les Américains l'ont fait avec la DARPA, et de concentrer nos efforts publics et ensuite privés, oui, capital public et privé, dans ces technologies de pointe dans les années à venir pour l'Europe. C'est pour moi la question que je pose. Et ça, c'est la clé. Et là, je vois une chose, c'est, on me dit toujours, l'Européen est risk averse. L'Européen n'est pas le risque. Et c'est pour ça on vit dans des termes budgétaires. On préfère avoir chaque année 2% de plus, au lieu de dire « j'ai risque l'argent ». Mais ça, on ne le fait pas. On a peur de ça. Et je ne sais pas pourquoi. Parce qu'on est parfaitement capable si on prenait notre destin en main.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois qu'on va prendre quelques questions du public. Levez la main, autrement moi j'en ai d'autres. Je crois que je peux donner la parole ici devant.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentations. I'm personally involved in different China programs, and China is an issue which has been mentioned here very much. I'm actually involved in a program, research program, which is financed by the European Commission. It's called Reconnect China. And the question we have got is, are there still possibilities, or what are the possibilities, what are the opportunities for still working together with China? Are there still possibilities? And that's, of course, a difficult question and difficult to answer also for us. Of course, the European Union has come with all kinds of keywords, like a strategic partner, economic competitor, systemic rival. De-risking is another topic which has been mentioned a lot. But what does it mean? What can we still do? We heard today in the panel that some talked about protective multilateralism, another about strategic autonomy. But what does it mean in terms of working together with China? Are there still avenues open for making contact with these countries, or should we totally close ourselves off from the cooperation with China? Thank you.
Who wants to answer? Klaus, ready?
Maybe I can start. Closing off would be suicide. And therefore I think Ursula von der Leyen was very skillful when she coined the expression de-risking instead of the Anglo-Saxon decoupling from China. I think that is the right approach. And I think the US is also moving in that direction. But Europe was first to differentiate between the two, between decoupling, which would mean what you just said, getting out of China, and de-risking. Economic relations with China are just too important. China is today almost 1/5 of the world economy. And we feel it when they slow down even. So to get out of China would not be wise. But of course one has to interact with them in a more assertive way, because they have misused the multilateral trading system to some extent. The trade deficit of Europe, the EU with China is something like 400 billion euro. And that is not fair trade. But I think the Commission is doing that when they go, and also when prime ministers, economic ministers from EU countries go to China, they talk about that much more today than in the past. So China has to move. And I think they also are a bit afraid of losing Europe. They know they are in a struggle with the United States about who is the superpower and number one in the world. And China sees its position as to be number two, like it was up to 200 years ago. So that's between China and the US. So we have to be careful here, but we need fair trade. And then there are certain areas where it really makes sense for both sides to cooperate. Climate change is an obvious topic, because we can only influence climate change if we have a global approach. And again, China is the biggest player here. So that's an area where I think both sides would agree that one should really cooperate also on research to make progress. And there are probably some other areas.
Merci. La parole.
May I say
oui?
just to work on research? It works, yeah. Because in order to explain how it works and why it goes to a certain direction. Europe was very strong on telephony. Europe has developed GSM and 4G. America was very strong on digital, and it didn't bother to invest on telephony. Now, we had a situation, very strong digital in the United States, very strong telephony in Europe. And both are leaning back. And in the meantime, China profits from our leaning back and develops 5G. Europe was nowhere on it, and America neither on 4G. So now everybody, including America and including Europe, is heavily investing on 6G. That means sometimes we do very big faults because we are simply not concentrating, and we are simply thinking that because we do something right, we do not prepare the future when this something which is right becomes old.
Sylvie MATELLY, et ensuite Pat Cox.
Merci. Juste une petite réaction à ce que vous disiez. L'ambassade de France à Washington envoie une fois tous les vendredis soirs une lettre sur la politique commerciale américaine en détaillant tout ce qui s'est passé, tout ce qui se passe à Washington. Et la lettre d'hier soir avait deux nouvelles qui étaient particulièrement intéressantes, et j'ai pas oublié votre question. La première, c'est le fait que les Américains ont un projet pour interdire la circulation de tout véhicule qui contiendrait des composants russes ou chinois, pour des questions de sécurité intérieure, bien évidemment, de contrôle des données, bien évidemment, mais aussi pour des questions économiques et d'intérêt économique bien compris des États-Unis. Premier élément. Et en même temps, la nouvelle suivante, c'était le fait qu'il y a une délégation en ce moment américaine qui est en train de négocier à Pékin sur la coopération économique entre les deux pays. C'est ce qu'on appelle du pragmatisme en réalité. Je crois que la politique de dérisking qui a été mise en œuvre ces dernières années a été relativement pragmatique, et c'est très intéressant effectivement, et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec tout ce que vous avez dit. Et en même temps, on reste quand même dans une certaine difficulté à accepter ce pragmatisme qui parfois nous fait aller dans des décisions qui peuvent être contradictoires. Alors j'ose espérer que ce qu'on appelle dans l'agenda stratégique, dans les lettres de mission qui ont été envoyées à Madame Kaja Kallas ou aux commissaires qui sont en charge du commerce, cette Foreign Economic Policy que je crois que l'on retrouvait déjà dans le rapport Draghi, j'ose espérer que ça nous permettra de gérer ces contradictions avec une politique étrangère, économique, défendant les intérêts des Européens de manière bien comprise et bien articulée. Mais voilà ce que je voulais répondre.
Pat Cox.
So we've had all the language, reshoring, onshoring, deglobalization, decoupling, and we've settled, and G7 also settled with European leadership on de-risking. And I agree with you, Sylvie. I think it leaves a lot of room for pragmatism and interpretation. I would make a point, firstly, about private industry and private investments by Europeans or United States or others in China. A well-run company, in governance terms, will keep a good risk register. And on its risk register, it will identify the degrees of risk associated with particular company policy. And if it's well run, they will have a series of risk mitigants that they identify to minimize the risk. So I would leave de-risking for the private sector largely to the private sector and their risk registers if they're well managed, because they know what they're doing. And I think at the political level, the how would I put it, the constructive ambiguity of the phrase de-risking is politically helpful. And as we all know, anyone who's been involved in politics, there is a strong positive role sometimes for constructive ambiguity in our use of language. Last thing I would say, at the last German presidency, Angela Merkel succeeded in closing out a negotiation, EU-China, on an investment accord. And Joe Biden, some months later, on the Uyghur issue in China, co-opted the EU that shared the human rights values to object to what China was doing. The European Parliament passed a resolution condemning China for its treatment of Uyghurs, and China then blacklisted key senior MEPs in the Parliament from visiting China, including the chair of the China delegation. The consequence was that the Parliament has refused to give its assent, which is required under the Lisbon Treaty, and with no parliamentary assent in the European Parliament, it could not pass, whether it will be controversial or not, for approval by national parliaments. So there was an example of a strategic space put together, which was taken apart by other issues. And these, in a way, are what I was trying to refer to earlier, that when there's a lot of pressure that comes from Washington, D.C., to do with a diplomatic push on a given issue, it's very hard sometimes for European foreign policy to disengage from the momentum. And that's why the accord with China fell victim, at least at this point in time. And it would be interesting to speculate, is Europe still interested in that accord? And could the politics be decoupled by a degree of negotiated rapprochement?
D'autres questions dans le public, monsieur?
Bonjour à toutes et tous, Pierre Tsvalen, député du canton de Vaud. Merci beaucoup pour ce débat. J'en ai été un peu déçu parce que j'ai l'impression qu'on a beaucoup plus parlé de la Chine et des États-Unis que de l'Europe. Est-ce que ce continent ne pourrait pas faire confiance à ses valeurs, en ses talents, pour se développer encore et pour assurer sa prospérité? J'ai peu entendu, malheureusement, parler du Green Deal et de la très belle orientation qu'a prise l'Union européenne ces dernières années et qui est certainement un gisement pour réussir une transition écologique juste et compétitive. C'est d'ailleurs le sens et le nom qui a été donné à l'une des importantes vice-présidentes de la Commission européenne, l'espagnole en l'occurrence, et je pense que c'est certainement là que l'Europe peut faire sa différence sur le plan mondial.
Merci.
Certainement en moins s'occupant de se comparer à la Chine ou aux États-Unis, mais en jouant sa propre voix, qui peut là être un grand succès.
Alors, qui veut répondre parmi les panélistes? Plus de confiance en soi, et puis aussi en la capacité de mener une transition écologique, peut-être de manière plus volontariste que d'autres. Pat Cox.
Just very briefly, I wouldn't like that we should leave the impression here today that people who sit on this platform, who've given the best part of their adult lives to their belief in Europe, is that we lack confidence in it. I think what the debate is about is trying to find the confidence to go forward in what has become an increasingly complex environment. This is not to abandon our confidence, but to orientate it to the challenges. I think you're quite correct that the Green Deal put Europe, as it has often been, as a global regulatory superpower in leadership to do with trying to form a transition. But what we've seen inside the EU, so we have to also observe this, is a good deal of pushback, particularly in agriculture, but not only. We have the issue about electric vehicles and what dates rules should apply and so on. And so in a certain way, if we want to give regulatory signals to the private sector, do we hold the line to orientate strategic investment policies of the private sector, or do we look for wriggle room and backslide? And every time we choose to take a step back from a strategic policy, we give mixed signals, not just to the rest of the world, but to our own producers and industries. And so my hope is that the new Commission and the Spanish Commissioner charged with this will focus on the strategic certainties related to the green transition and the energy transition in order to give to European industrialists and researchers and innovators a clear perspective of what future to expect, first in Europe, and by extension, if it is leadership, potentially elsewhere also.
J'aimerais enchaîner avec une question peut-être pour Sylvie MATELLY. En fait, est-ce qu'une des difficultés de l'Union européenne aussi dans ce processus de décision et d'émergence de la volonté générale, c'est qu'en fait, par rapport aux États-Unis ou à la Chine, dans l'Union européenne, on agit en toute transparence. On a vu hier des exemples où les prises de décision ont mûri de manière discrète et confidentielle, comme nous l'a expliqué Klaus REGLING, et dans le comité monétaire, où les décisions étaient préparées en toute confidentialité. Mais finalement, maintenant, l'Union européenne, elle peut se poser des agendas, des dates butoirs, des livres blancs, mais tout ça est extraordinairement transparent, là où les Chinois ne le sont pas toujours, et là où les Américains sont parfois un peu machiavéliques.
C'est une excellente question. Merci de me l'avoir posée. Et je réfléchis tout en répondant. Au-delà de la transparence, et c'est ce qui est souvent reproché d'ailleurs par les acteurs privés, les entreprises en particulier, aux institutions européennes, il y a la volonté aussi de porter et de défendre systématiquement ce qui fait l'Europe, c'est-à-dire les valeurs de l'Europe. La transparence en fait partie, mais de la démocratie, et puis sur les questions de pacte vert et de transition vers une économie plus juste, plus solidaire et écologique, eh bien on a vu, moi j'avais suivi ça sur les questions de défense, toutes ces normes qui ont été, ces normes de reporting, de transparence qui ont été imposées aux entreprises et qui, c'est vrai, créent des contraintes qui peuvent à terme, et qui sont, je suis convaincue à terme, constituent un avantage comparatif et constitueront un avantage comparatif. Je disais ça à une entreprise qui est très présente en Afrique et qui se lamentait à juste titre il y a quelques années parce que une entreprise du bâtiment, parce que quand ils construisaient un pont, le même pont construit par des Chinois ne coûtait pas le même tarif parce qu'il y avait toutes les contraintes de lutte contre la corruption, etc., etc. Mais je lui disais oui, sauf que quand il s'agit d'embaucher de la main-d'œuvre locale, vous attirez les meilleurs, parce que les conditions de travail sont différentes des Chinois. Donc effectivement, on peut capitaliser sur ces aspects-là, et c'est un élément très important, mais à court terme, ça reste malgré tout des contraintes. Alors visiblement, la Commission a décidé de s'y attaquer. Moi, je crains qu'on s'y attaque, mais par le mauvais côté du sujet, c'est-à-dire en essayant de nous rendre aussi moins 10 ans finalement que la Chine. Donc ça, c'était le premier élément de ma réponse. Et puis pour pas être trop long, deuxième élément, je crois qu'il faut aussi bien prendre conscience que quand on décide, on est 27, avec des cultures différentes, des histoires différentes, des perceptions différentes. Encore une fois, je vais revenir sur mes sujets que sont les questions de défense. On est d'accord sur le fait qu'il faut investir plus pour se défendre, mais vous avez d'un côté les pays qui ont des industries d'armement et qui souhaiteraient que l'on mette en tout premier, en haut de l'agenda, la préférence européenne, et on achète d'abord des armements européens. Et puis ceux qui n'ont pas d'industrie de défense, donc pas cet intérêt-là, et qui disent oui, mais avant qu'on puisse fournir en européen, il va falloir 20 ans et des programmes en commun, etc., etc. Donc finalement, autant acheter aux Américains, aux Sud-Coréens et autres. Donc vous voyez, je crois qu'il y a quand même tous ces éléments qui entrent en ligne de compte. Et finalement, pour aller pour répondre et être un peu plus positif peut-être que ce que je ne l'ai été depuis le début, quand on regarde le chemin parcouru depuis le début de la construction européenne, mais aussi depuis toutes ces crises dont on parlait, de 2008, 2016, etc., etc., je ne vais pas refaire l'histoire, malgré tout cela, on avance quand même. Et je rejoins ce que vous disiez, Pat, sur le côté l'Europe. Je crois que c'est vous. Je ne voudrais pas me tromper et fâcher l'un de mes voisines ou voisins. L'Europe est l'Union européenne est l'exemple même d'un multilatéralisme qui marche. Et ça, c'est très très important à avoir toujours en tête, parce que ça ne marche pas parfaitement, c'est plus difficile le multilatéralisme que le chacun pour soi et je défends d'abord mon intérêt, mais on a, je crois, une recette qui, malgré tout, in fine, nous permet d'avancer.
Oui, mais Schuman l'a dit, l'Europe se fera par ses crises.
Voilà.
C'est la réalité.
Joachim BITTERLICH, vous qui avez accompagné Helmut Kohl, dites-nous, l'opacité dans le processus de décision, ça, compte tenu de votre expérience, ça donne plus d'efficience ou bien est-ce que finalement, à plus long terme, avec la transparence des prises de décision, on gagne toujours?
Il n'y a pas de oui et de non. Vous avez besoin, dans une certaine phase, de préparer des décisions, ce que j'appelle à huis clos. C'est normal. Mais de l'autre côté, ça n'exclut pas du tout, de l'autre côté, de montrer la transparence vis-à-vis de l'extérieur. Mais ça n'a pas, je dirais, de sens aujourd'hui, lorsque je regarde, il y a une crise qui éclate, vous voyez les réactions par les médias sociaux pendant 3 jours, et le politique a lentement peur de prendre une décision. Du coup, c'est souvent le cas pour moi, ce que j'observe simplement. Il a peur des médias sociaux quelque part. On appelle ça transparence. Parce que la réaction est n'importe comment et n'importe quoi. Du coup, il préfère, et ce n'est presque plus possible, de préparer quelque chose à huis clos. Par exemple, j'ai un rêve pour les ministres de la Défense de les enfermer dans un monastère sans portable, sans ordinateur, et qu'ils réfléchissent comment mettre en œuvre, en pratique, the European Pillar within NATO. De faire cela et de manière pratique. C'est mon rêve, si vous voulez. Je sais que c'est presque irréaliste, parce que n'importe quoi, n'importe où, vous voyez par les tweets, par les SMS, ce que j'appelle la transparence est établie en 3 minutes. Ouais. La politique a besoin, ce que j'appelle de la réflexion à huis clos. Même le parlementaire en a besoin, de discuter à huis clos avant qu'il sorte vers le public. C'est-à-dire, l'un n'exclut pas du tout l'autre.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois qu'il y avait madame qui avait une question ici.
Oui, merci. Alessia Setti, PhD candidate in political science at the University of Lausanne. I think a few of you mentioned the fact that some member states might be a problem, you said, Madam Reding, sometimes, or the 27 might have different positions. To what extent do you think that some challenges that you mentioned could be managed through differentiated integration, or would that lead only to further fragmentation? Do you think that in some policy areas we can have a group of member states that go forward and the others maybe might join later, or do you think this is not really feasible? Thank you.
Alors, Madame Reding, est-ce que ce sera tous ensemble ou bien en petits groupes avancés?
Oui, c'est une discussion que nous menons pendant des décennies. L'Europe a plusieurs vitesses. Je pourrais mettre maintenant des noms et des écrits. Je vous dis mon opinion. L'Europe à une vitesse, c'est déjà assez compliqué. On n'a pas besoin de plusieurs layers supplémentaires. Ça pour les 27. Maintenant, si on va vers l'élargissement, par exemple, vers les Balkans, est-ce qu'on pourrait s'imaginer avant élargissement, dans un pas avant l'élargissement? Là, oui, mais pour ceux qui sont dedans, non. On doit faire le contraire. On doit essayer d'éliminer les fragmentations et ne pas ajouter des fragmentations.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, on vient de me...
But maybe I can add that, of course, we have seen differentiation. The euro is one important example, where it started with 11 countries. Now there are 20 out of 27 countries member of the euro area. Schengen is another example. So we have seen good examples. And I think with the EU growing, and it will grow for the reasons we heard, this will probably be feature that's even more necessary. But I think it's always important to keep then the inner circle open for the outer countries. That's an important requisite.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, je disais qu'on m'avait montré la petite pancarte qui dit que c'est bientôt fini. Je pense qu'on pourrait encore débattre et parler pendant des heures. On a quand même brassé 75 ans d'histoire, beaucoup d'enjeux. Je voudrais donner la parole pour un tout petit mot de conclusion à tous nos débatteurs et peut-être pour justement aider à cette conclusion. Quelles sont vos principales attentes vis-à-vis de la nouvelle Commission européenne dans sa configuration? Est-ce qu'ils vont être des leaders ou est-ce que vous comptez plutôt sur le Conseil européen? Pat Cox.
I think it is essential that the European Commission sets out a strategic leadership capacity and seeks to encourage, massage, cajole, push, whatever they should do, reluctant members of the Council towards consensus on critically important issues. And I think on that enlargement issue we touched on very briefly, one of the great strengths of European engagement is that it is a voluntary engagement, freely chosen by free and sovereign peoples. This is not old European imperialism or new Russian imperialism. This is by choice of sovereign peoples. And if the sovereign peoples of the Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova and so on wish to join, we have a duty of care to accommodate them. It's not instant, it's not easy, but it is a requirement also for our own geopolitical stability on our eastern borders and on our Balkan borders, because if we don't do it, if we leave vacuums, others will fill them. This is the rule of politics. You leave a vacuum, it's filled. So I think the Commission in its strategy should be driving this front and centre and should, as I said, encourage every way they can the European Council to give their support.
Merci de rappeler la volonté des peuples et la responsabilité des institutions. Viviane Reding.
Oui, la Commission est bien constituée. Les responsabilités sont bien divisées. Ce qu'il faut maintenant, c'est faire. On a sur la table toutes les analyses. On a toutes les propositions. On n'a plus besoin de faire d'autres analyses, d'autres propositions et d'autres discussions. Il faut simplement choisir les éléments, et nous en avons souligné plusieurs, et les faire avec des propositions concrètes, où les États membres alors doivent dire oui ou non, et le Parlement doit dire oui ou non. Mais plus de longues discussions autour du sexe des anges. Voilà.
Merci Viviane Reding. Klaus, REGLING?
Yes, I fully agree with that. We know what should be done. That's not the issue. The problem is that Viviane said earlier are the member states. And under these circumstances, the Commission should be and will be in the lead of formulating a strategy. And then the question is what will trigger stronger cooperation among member states. And that is always difficult to say when you are in the middle of a problem. But I gave some examples earlier where we were in a crisis and Europe rose to the occasion several times. It's not hopeless. It may be triggered by the geopolitics. It may be triggered by Trump. And I agree with Joachim that even if Mrs. Harris is elected, we will deal with that. But Trump could trigger a stronger reaction in Europe because it may become unavoidable. But it's hard to predict what will trigger more cooperation. There will be new leaders coming up eventually in different countries. That remains to be seen. The problem are the member states. We know what to do, and the Commission will have to play a strong role.
Thank you. Sylvie, MATELLY.
Merci. Je viens d'un milieu et d'un monde où on travaillait beaucoup plus sur la géopolitique et en fait où notre horizon c'était vraiment le monde et ça fait un petit peu moins d'1 an, bientôt 1 an que j'ai rejoint l'Institut Jacques Delors et ce qui m'a surpris dans un premier temps c'est que le centre du monde pour les Européens c'est quand même Bruxelles. Et ce que je trouve, et ça rejoint ce que vous disiez Madame Reding, c'est que la nouvelle commission, même sur les questions internationales et sur les questions de politique étrangère, est véritablement armée pour relever les défis qui nous sont posés et en particulier le défi, vous le soulignez monsieur, d'arriver à se sortir de cette confrontation Chine-États-Unis qui, qu'on le veuille ou non, structure quand même notre économie mondiale pour proposer peut-être une troisième voie. Donc tout est là, je vous rejoins. Simplement, je trouve que la responsabilité que porte sur ses épaules monsieur Costa, le président du Conseil, est quand même sacrément lourde. J'espère et je croise les doigts pour qu'il soit à la hauteur, mais je pense qu'il va être un personnage clé pour répondre à la question que vous avez posée.
Merci. Joachim BITTERLICH, votre pronostic, votre analyse?
Tout est dit, j'ai l'impression. Mon seul appel est Commission et Conseil européen, comprenez que vous devez prendre en main l'agenda des années à venir. Autrement, les extrêmes vont gagner en Europe. Agenda setting. Et arrêtez de rester à la défensive. Vous regagnez uniquement la confiance des citoyens si vous êtes à la tête du mouvement. Chaque homme politique commettra des fautes, c'est normal. Mais ce que les citoyens doivent obtenir, c'est l'impression qu'ils font leur mieux pour le futur, c'est tout.
Alors, moteur et action. Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais qu'on applaudisse nos débatteurs. Voilà, et je rends le micro à Lucie.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for assisting these 2 days of colloquium. I won't hold you hostage any further. Just a very quick word to close off these wonderful 2 days that were so rich and interesting for all of us. First and foremost, on behalf of the foundation, I'd like to thank all our wonderful speakers. To cite Pat Cox, our president, we're very honored to have you here with us today, and we're very happy to have had you. Thank you to the University of Lausanne, of course, for their support, whether it be technical or just in general. And finally, thank you to all my fantastic colleagues who always work so hard to make these events possible. Thank you to Michael Geller, of course, for his whole coordination of this colloquium. And finally, I wish you all an excellent rest of your weekend. Thank you so much.